Single out salute. I'm Lord Maitreya, the hip hop futurist. You're now tuned into the Super Longevity Institute podcast. This afternoon, I have a very special guest. I know I say this all the time, but tonight I really have a special guest. I'm just gonna give you a brief bio. He is an attorney and a co-founder of the People's Law Office, where clients included the Black Panthers, Students for a Democratic Society, community activists, and a large number of those opposed to the Vietnam War. He handled cases involving prisoners' rights, Puerto Rican nationalists, protesters opposed to human rights violation in Central America, police torture, and the wrongfully accused. Ladies and gentlemen, transhumanist hip hop futurists worldwide, Mr. Jeffery Haas. Did I say your last name right, Mr. Haas?
Well, we usually say Haas.
Haas. Okay, thank you. I wasn't sure. I was trying to look everywhere to see if they said your name. I wasn't sure. All right, thank you for correcting me, and thank you for coming on the show. I have so many questions for you.
My pleasure. Glad to be.
For my audience who doesn't know about Fred Hampton, can you take us back to December 4th, 1969, when Fred Hampton was assassinated?
Yeah, I'd like to begin a little earlier than that, just talking about who Fred was.
Okay.
Because Fred Hampton grew up in Maywood, which is a working class suburb of Chicago. Both his mom and dad had moved to Chicago area from Louisiana, and they grew up on plantations where their grandparents had been slaves. So they settled in the western suburbs, excuse me, of Chicago. Of Chicago, and got a job at a factory there. And Fred grew up in that neighborhood, and Fred his mother told me once that when he was 10 years old, on Saturday mornings, some of the kids didn't have enough to eat, and he would go round up the neighborhood kids and have them come over to his house and serve breakfast for him. So in a way, he started his own Breakfast for Children program when he was really young.
Wow.
But Fred was as his dad told me, he said Fred just couldn't accept injustice anywhere. So particularly when he got to high school, he led a walkout because black girls weren't considered for homecoming queen, and also because there weren't enough black teachers and administrators. He also led a march to have a swimming pool because there was no place in Maywood where black kids could swim in the summertime. So from the get-go, he was both an organizer and someone who couldn't accept inequality. He also marched with Dr. King when Dr. King came to Chicago in '67. But when somebody with him got spit on, a woman by a white woman, he said, well, I don't know if I'm going to be nonviolent when the people against us are violent. But Fred had this really robust, friendly, warm personality, and people were drawn to him. The other thing that's sort of unique about Fred was his speaking ability. And actually, he started with a speech defect, and he overcame that by practicing, and he actually memorized the speeches of Dr. King and also Malcolm X, so that he actually, and he went to church with his parents and picked up a lot of the cadence of the ministers. So it's not an accident. He wasn't born with that, but he developed that. So he was outspoken. He was a leader. He actually was called back to high school when there was racial tensions by the principal to help work things out. And then he was noticed by the NAACP, the suburban NAACP in Chicago, in the Chicago suburbs, and he became the head of that at age 17. And in the next year, it grew from like 50 members to 250 members. So Fred was a natural organizer, and he just, people listened to him and followed him. And when SNCC wanted to start a Panther chapter in Chicago, they said, here's the person who should be the chairman. And so they had learned about it. He also introduced Stokely Carmichael at a rally in the suburbs, and Stokely and other people said, "Who is this guy? He's such a great
Wow.
speaker."
Mm.
So when the Panthers started in Chicago in late '68, Fred was the chairman. Um, Bobby Rush was the defense minister, and it was a bunch of interesting. I mean, a lot of community college people, college kids. There were some kids from the neighborhood.
Mm.
They were all drawn, very young. A
Mm.
lot of them were 18 to 22. Were
Wow.
drawn to, and I was on a panel with this woman, and they said, "Why'd you join the Panthers?" And she said, "Well, because we were demanding our rights. We weren't asking for them." And so for
Mm.
young black people in the late 60s, here was something that they could connect to and believe in. And the slogan and the idea of black power also had taken over the country. Stokely said, "I never had an idea that that phrase was such a tremendous effect." So for young black people who are also seeing riots all over the country, who also the situation of urban blacks didn't change much with the Public Accommodations Act, that the Jim Crow laws weren't written in Chicago to say black people can't come into these housing areas. That's what the real estate people did,
Wow.
including the federal government. So under Fred's leader, Fred and other people, and there were a lot of women who were involved in the early formation of the Panthers. And they started both programs, a breakfast program. They sold a lot of newspapers. They eventually had a health program. And they also had a 10-point program, which looks a lot like, Black Lives Matter today, demanding an
Mm.
end to police brutality, community control of police, don't fight in imperialist wars. Everybody should have decent housing, food, shelter, and education. I mean, the basic things that the Panthers were demanding. Uh, they were showing people through the breakfast program that why should your kids go to school hungry in this country? So, in fact, as Fred said, not everybody all the moms who come to the breakfast program don't necessarily believe in socialism, but they sure like our breakfast program. So it was an
Mm.
experiment in showing people what they did.
Right.
Um, Meanwhile, across the street from where Fred lived, there was uh, there was an ice cream vendor, and somebody held him down and passed out 71 bars of ice cream.
Mm.
And Fred and other people came across the street to see what was happening, and the cops identified Fred. And so, what should have been, there was nobody injured, the property damage was minimal, but instead they charged him with robbery. And
Wow.
so, as we were forming, Fred actually got convicted, and he was going to get probation, but they gave the judge, who was very much under the power of the prosecutor at that time, Ed Hanrahan, the heir apparent to Mayor Daley. The prosecutor recommended, the judge gave him 2 to 5 years.
Wow.
He went to prison in Menard, in southern Illinois. And that sort of, Fred had come to one of my eventual partners and said, we need a people's law office. We need the Panthers, the Young Lords are getting busted every time we step out in the street to have a demonstration, to sell a newspaper.
Wow.
So we thought, well, that was Dennis Cunningham and I, and so we set out, and in August of '69, we opened the People's Law Office in a former sausage shop, although we kept the
Mm.
that said Floss's homemade sausage.
Oh, wow.
And within 3 months of our opening, and we were representing Panthers and Young Lords and anti-war people, I get a call on the morning of December 4th, or my law partner shows up. Now, I had at that point heard Fred speak, that speech that's been captured many times about, I'm not going to die slipping on a piece of ice. I'm not going to die of a heart attack. I'm going to die fighting in the International Proletarian Revolution. And I was there at the church, and that was right after we got him out on an appeal bond.
Wow.
And Fred said to I was too white. There was some white people there, but it was a mostly black audience. And
Mm.
so in the middle of his speech, after Fred said, I've been down to Menard, I've picked up the spirit of the people, I picked up the beat of the people. And then he said, listen, if you're not going to do a revolutionary act, I don't want myself on your mind. If you
Mm.
dare to struggle, you dare to win. If you peace for you if you're willing to do it. And they said up, he said, stand up. And we did. And he said, now raise your right hand. And we did. And he said, I am. And we said, I am. And then he said, a revolutionary. And I kind of considered myself a lawyer for the movement, but not of the movement.
Right.
But I didn't, the word stuck in my throat. But by the third or fourth time, I was yelling, I am a revolutionary as loudly as everybody else. And it was a threshold that Fred took me and other people. And that was in August of '69. 3 months later, I get a knock on my door at 6:30 in the morning, and it's one of my new law partners, Skip Andrew. And I open the door, and he says, the chairman's been murdered. The pigs vamped on his crib this morning, and he and someone else were killed. And I couldn't believe it, because Fred seemed so bigger than life and made all of us feel bigger than life. And I just stood there stunned. And he said, and I kind of said, what'll I do? He said, well, I'm going to go to the morgue and then to the apartment where the shooting took place. There are some survivors who weren't shot. Why don't you go to the jail and interview them? So I, somewhere around 8 o'clock on that morning, maybe 3 hours after the raid, and on the way I heard the police version that they claimed they knocked on the door, had a search warrant, and the Panthers opened fire and kept shooting at them. And they claimed there were over 90 shots fired. And as they said there, but the grace of God, nobody was injured. And Hanrahan was holding that press conference with weapons that supposedly came from the Panther crib. So that was the story the police put out right away. When I got to the jail, there was an order not to let me see Deborah Johnson, who was Fred Hampton's fiance, now Akua Najeri. But I pulled out a book and said it's a felony not to allow a lawyer to see a client in custody. Right. So they let me in. And I walked into this interview room and sat down, tiny space, and then the other door opened on the other side of the table, and in comes Akua in a nightgown, obviously very pregnant. And she sat down. She was still sobbing. And I sort of didn't know if she knew who I was. She knew who People's Law Office was. And I introduced myself and said, how are you? And how's the baby? And she said, well, I'm all right, I guess. And I said, what happened? And she said, well, we were in the back bedroom, and we were sleeping, and all of a sudden we heard all these bullets all around us. The bed was shaking. And I actually got on top of Fred to try to protect him. And there was this lull in the shooting, and they came out and they pulled me out of the room. Somebody yelled to the police, there's a pregnant sister back here. So the firing stopped for a minute, and they pulled me out of the room. And then I saw two of the police go in, and I heard one of them say, is he dead yet? And then I heard two shots, and the other one said, he's good and dead now.
Wow.
And that's what she told me she witnessed on the morning of December 4th. And I didn't know what to do. I just thought, well, what can I do? You know. But anyway, that's the way the story began for me.
Wow. It must have been amazing. Just hearing Fred Hampton, that speech at the People's Church in 1969, right before his death, must have been. That must have been amazing to see him speak. And he was only 21 years old, right, when he passed away.
Right. Actually, he was 20 when he gave a speech, and then he turned 21 in August, and he was killed in December. So, yeah. And I wasn't that much older. I was 26, I think, at that time. Wow. So, but, you know, he had so much poise and so much charisma and, you know, youthful energy, I guess. And I had been sort of hesitant. Do I really want to join this People's Law Office? I was working at Legal Aid. I had a salary.
Wow.
Do we want to take on a new entity? And I, partly after listening to Fred, I said, yeah, I want to be part of this. And so 4 lawyers and 2 law students started the People's Law Office in the summer of '69.
Wow. Shout outs to all those great men. Maitreya one here at the Super Longevity Institute would like to give a big, warm shout out and thank you to the People's Law Firm for all their hard work and struggle, because I know that's a scary time, because what you guys unveiled was a conspiracy by the FBI. Because who do you think sent the raid? Who sent the order for the raid? It,
Well, what began then first as a defense of the Panthers who survived, and it turned out Fred Hampton was murdered and assassinated, and Mark Clark, another Panther from Peoria, was killed at the front door. 4 Panthers were shot, one of whom very seriously they took a machine gun and went through a wall, and he had 4 bullets in his colon, and he survived, but he never really regained his full health because they had to take out a good part of his colon. That was Doc Satchel, who was the head of the medical clinic. And then they falsely charged the survivors with attempted murder. So we got other lawyers and we defended them, and then they dropped the charges. And then there was a federal grand jury which didn't indict the cops but came out with a report critical. And so we decided, and we talked to Fred's mother, Iberia, and Fanny Clark, Mark Clark's mother, and said, well, we're not ready to just let it go. So we filed a civil suit against the police, the investigative unit of the police, the crime lab. It turned out the crime lab claimed the proof that the Panthers fired was 2 shotgun shells that they said matched a Panther weapon. It turned out they didn't, and they weren't even similar. They came from a police weapon. So the whole story that Hanrahan and the police were putting out kind of fell apart. We brought an expert in, and he put these wooden dowels through the bullet holes, and you can tell an entry hole from an exit hole. The entry hole is smaller, and on the exit, wood is splayed outward. So we set these dowels, and looked at them, and there was approximately 90 shots coming in from different parts, all from the side of the apartment that the police entered. The only Panther shot was into the ceiling in the hallway, we think by Mark Clark, after he was already fatally hit, because it went up directly into the ceiling. So we thought, we had a pretty, strong case of basically of civil rights violations of right to life. They came in shooting, but we were just beginning to think, well, this was another police raid. They knew about the Panthers, and they came in there. Some of them probably knew Fred was there. Whether all 14 cops sat down and said, we're going to kill Fred in his bed, or 3 or 4 of them knew where he might be sleeping. So we pursued this suit, and what was uncovered through litigation, through discovery, through talking to people, through the church committee, was the police had a floor plan that they entered with. The floor plan showed all the rooms in the apartment and included the bed, and it said on the diagram, bed where Hampton and Johnson sleep. And that was the place where most of the bullets kind of converged. Wow. So then, of course, we said, well, who wrote that diagram and where did it come from? And we kept asking, and it turned out there was an FBI informant named William O'Neill, who was close to Fred in some ways, although people say Fred had suspicions of him. But he had, at the request of his FBI handler, Roy Mitchell, he got a floor plan of that apartment showing not only where every room was, but where all the furniture was, including the beds. And O'Neill gave that floor plan to his control agent, who then took it to these police who were assigned to Hanrahan. Right. Now, Hanrahan was the successor to Mayor Daley, the likely successor. He had grown up in the Irish neighborhood. He went to Harvard Law. He'd been the U.S. attorney. So Hanrahan thought that getting credit for this raid would advance his career. In fact, when the facts came out, it ended his political career. Because one of the things the Panthers did after we set these dowels up, the Panthers said, we want the community to come through the apartment and see what happened. And see the blood-soaked bed where Fred was, to see the place where they dragged his body out, almost like a trophy, and to see the shots in the walls. And hundreds, if not thousands of people went through that apartment, and it was cold in December, but nevertheless, thousands went through it, and the Panthers led them on a tour. Wow. And so, including the press. And Hanrahan kept sticking to this story, and he came up with, well, look at these 2 black dots by the back door. Those are shots from Fred Hampton's bedroom.
Mm-hmm.
uh, and we to press get these in the head. So the official story eventually fell apart because the ballistics evidence didn't fit it.
Mm.
Uh, so we began to learn about this thing called the COINTELPRO program.
Right.
That was a program that Hoover set up years before, generally attacking all of the left, but the black movement was the major target.
Mm-hmm.
Stokely had been a target, Elijah Muhammad had been a target,
Wow.
Malcolm X would have been probably if he hadn't been killed earlier. Dr. King was a target. Blacks, basically any black national leader, they considered a threat. Hoover did. And
Wow.
so this program, when we uncovered its directions, it was uh, basically to destroy the Black Panther Party by any means necessary, including the breakfast program. Disrupt, destroy, and neutralize the Black Panthers, and not prevent their coalition, prevent their being seen publicly by the press, take away their support. But there was one other mandate that they had, uh, which was prevent the rise of a Messiah who could
Wow.
unify and electrify the black masses.
Wow.
And so O'Neill was acting, and his control agent was acting pursuant to this program when they got this floor plan together and gave it to Hanrahan's police, knowing that they would probably act on it and wanting to keep their own footprint out of it.
Mm.
So we think it was that particular memo which directed them to prevent, and Fred fit a lot of that description. He was reaching out to gangs. He had formed a coalition with the Young Lords and Young Patriots,
Mm.
uh, Puerto Rican and a white Appalachian group. And he had worked with the anti-war movement. So
Mm.
Fred was a threat in many ways, not just because of the Panthers or who he was, but I think they were particularly afraid if he could unite people in the neighborhood, including the gangs, and he did achieve some gang truces.
Wow.
But they actually sent part of this program. They sent a letter to Jeff Fort, the leader of the Blackstone Rangers.
Wow.
They said because they wrote it on just a hand wrote it on blank stationery, and it said, "Dear brother Jeff, I'm just a guy's hanging out in the neighborhood. I've been hanging out with the Panthers. They got a hit out on you. I know what I'd do if I were you." Signed a black brother. So basically, they were telling the largest, most well-armed gang in Chicago that the Panthers had a hit out on their leader, expecting them to retaliate and do their dirty work. I think Fred was probably suspicious of this note that didn't sound so much like a black brother.
Right.
So they didn't act on it, but it showed their intent. Their
Right.
intent was to use violence. You know,
Wow.
when we asked the FBI guy, the author of that memo, what did he mean by there's a hit out on you? He said,
Mm.
a hit's a nonviolent attack. We said, really? That's not usually the way it's used. Anyway, this took 13 years, a trial in which the judge dismissed the jury while they were deliberating. We had to go up on appeal. We finally got some justice when they said we had presented more than enough evidence to show a conspiracy to kill Fred and a conspiracy to cover it up, um, and got them a new trial. Got a new trial and actually settled the case for $1.85 million for the families of Fred and Mark and the survivors, both wounded and not. So
Mm.
I think we exposed what happened, but
Mm.
over the years, both Flint and I, who are the main trial attorneys, became really close friends with Fred's mother and father and brother and sister, and she was sort of like a mother to us, and maybe we were sort of like sons to her, you know. And after all we uncovered, and even after we got them the money, and she said, I said, "What do you think?" And she said, "They got away with murder,"
Yeah.
and I think that's still true.
Yeah. That's unfortunate that nobody was held accountable. Um, Mr. Has your sound. I didn't want to interrupt you, but check your sound. I think there's like some static coming from you, and I want
Uh-oh.
to make sure I hear you for the remainder. Really clear
Oh,
out that in the
all
background.
right. Uh,
Let me see.
Wait
Let
a
me see
minute.
if I can.
Oh, I'm terribly sorry.
It sounds like a fan.
Yeah,
No
it
problem.
does sometimes.
One, two.
If I turn my computer off and back on,
I
it
think
might. Would that work, or can I
no,
do
no,
that?
no, no, no. It's okay. We can go on. It's not.
And maybe it's maybe that I don't think I have that many open things. Uh, so I'm
It's
trying to
okay.
get.
I can still hear you clearly. I just don't know
Yeah,
how
no,
it's gonna sound on a when I
no,
play it
sorry.
back, but it doesn't sound terrible. Okay, but I want
No,
to ask you.
yeah. Go ahead.
Um, so you said J. Edgar Hoover had a counterintelligence program. I just want to wrap things up
Yeah,
for the viewers who probably are not too familiar with what COINTELPRO is.
sure.
And when you say that it was to prevent the rise of a black messiah, I know some of my audience is gonna that's very unfamiliar with them. Um uh it's so I just wanna so you said the church committee is the people who found out about this COINTELPRO program that the government had, like undisclosed documents.
Well, after Watergate, when it was exposed that Nixon was involved in the burglary at the Watergate, there was a federal uh, committee under Senator Church that was investigating illegal government activity.
Wow.
So they investigated the plumbers, but they also investigated and discovered pro COINTELPRO. So while we were getting documents in our case through discovery, they were also getting documents from the church committee. And so we actually talked to them. They gave us some of the overall documents outlining the program, and we gave them some of the documents showing how they actually operated in Chicago, how they played on creating dissension between organizations, how they had done that in California, set up conflicts between the Panthers and U.S. and other organizations. Uh, and Dr. King, of course, was a target of COINTELPRO. They were blackmailing him, telling him they had recordings of conversations of him with women in hotel rooms. And if he didn't kill himself, they were going to release those to the public.
Mm-hmm.
So they were actively out to discredit
Wow.
Dr. King. And as I said, they also mentioned Elijah Muhammad, and they mentioned Malcolm X, and they mentioned Stokely Carmichael as possible people who fit the description of the Black Messiah who could prevent the rise of a Black Messiah. Uh,
Um wow, very interesting. And J. Edgar Hoover at the time was the head of the FBI, right?
J. Edgar Hoover was the head of the FBI. He'd been that for 40 years. He had something on every president so that they couldn't really call him out for doing illegal things. What we also discovered after the trial was that O'Neill got a $300 bonus after the raid. The informant who provided the floor plan, and the FBI knew that it led to the murder of Fred and Mark, gave him a $300 bonus. And actually, we just uncovered 6 months ago new documents that showed that Mitchell also got a bonus
Wow.
for his exemplary work for the FBI. So while the FBI was publicly denying any role in the raid, internally they were taking credit and rewarding the people who actually set up the raid itself.
Wow. Incredible. Wow. Um so no one was ever held accountable for the murder of Mark Clark or Fred Hampton. And I'm wondering, is there still any undisclosed documents that people are trying to get released from the FBI? Is there anything that needs to be released that we need to fight for?
Um, yes, things have come. Somebody put in a request for Roy Mitchell's personnel file, and they got that in part, and it shows people higher up. It wasn't just the head of the FBI in Chicago, Marlon Johnson, and it wasn't just Roy Mitchell, but Hoover and his top two assistants were watching this and rewarding Mitchell and O'Neill and telling them, encouraging them to pass this information to the police and afterward rewarding them. We didn't have all those documents. We would have liked to have gone to depose Hoover himself, although he passed away in the middle while we were doing the suit. But maybe we would have even gone up to to Nixon and John Mitchell. When did they get told about this, and what was their response?
Right.
More people at the highest levels of the FBI and probably the White House knew about this raid, encouraged it, and certainly afterward uh, were taking credit for it.
Right.
So
Because
there are more details, things coming out. Yes, and even the documents we got in December 6 months ago
wow.
had redactions in them. They said if anybody gets subpoenaed to the grand jury, there was a local grand jury that was investigating Hanrahan and the police. They got charged with obstructing justice, not murder, which they almost did, and then they had a friendly judge declare them innocent after a farce of a trial. Um, but even those documents said if any FBI agent gets subpoenaed to a grand jury and they're asked about COINTELPRO, it was blank, uh, tell them to leave the grand jury and check with their superiors. So the cover up still continues, and there are more documents to get. Bobby Rush, who's a congressman from Chicago and who was the defense minister, sent a letter to the new attorney general asking for all the documents relating to the Chicago Panthers and the Panther raid.
Wow. You heard that. Anybody listening, please stay attuned to what he just said. They're still fighting for more unreleased documents that they're holding regarding the police raid and the assassination of Mark Clark and Fred Hampton. We need to fight for that. We need to all the media outlets, all the hip hop media outlets. They need to be talking about this. We need to spread this information because what we're seeing today is, when you see the influx of gang activity that hip hop helps stop, and the struggles and the Panthers and the struggle that came before us helped to prevent, is now escalating. We're seeing more. But if we had great leaders like we seen in the Panthers back then, we probably wouldn't have these same issues at the magnitude that we have them today. Um,
I think I would agree with you because, particularly on the west side of Chicago, where the Panthers were and where Fred was, the result of getting rid of a natural born leader who could. One of the things about Fred is he could speak to welfare mothers, he could speak to gang members, he could speak to a law students.
hmm,
So he really had the ability to bring people together. And I think as a result of his murder, I think gangs and drugs had a much bigger influence, or still do maybe, because these natural leaders had been taken out by the police and the FBI.
wow, wow. I really think that this is a special special show, and a lot of people's gonna ask me, um, well, why you call yourself a futurist? Why are you having these discussions on things that happened in the past? Yeah, well, we need to know. We need to get these informations of the past from the people who were there to tell their stories, so we can get the insight, and we can, improve our strategy to combat oppression and inhumaneness that we see in the society today. We need all of these. We need to look. We need to have a look. We need to have a glance, an eye in the past, and look at the history that came before us before we can even move forward, people. So please do not hit me up with futurists while you have um great historical leaders like Jeffery Haas. You know, we having this discussion so the hip hop community can benefit from his insight. Um, you said something about the Young Lords too. The Young Lords was based out in Chicago.
It started in Chicago.
I
It
didn't even know
started
that.
as a street gang, and then they got involved in fighting gentrification in Lincoln Park.
Wow.
And then, of course, I think they became even more prominent in New York. But they started in Chicago with Cha Cha Jimenez and a group of young Puerto Rican people in Lincoln Park, and the whole Puerto Rican community was driven out, and they changed from being like a street gang to fighting gentrification and also being in alliance with the Panthers and
Wow.
setting up their own breakfast program in a church where they had a friendly minister.
Wow. Wow. Do you? Oh, yeah. I have to ask this, right? Do you think that there's something that's similar to a COINTELPRO that's out now when you look and you see what's going on in the world today? Do you think in the country today? Do you think there's something similar against people of struggle and people that's forward thinking?
Absolutely. And they ended the quote COINTELPRO program. That's the program by that name.
Mm-hmm.
But they've continued their operations, particularly against the black movement. They consider the enemy black identity extremists, is what they call leaders of the BLM movement, and
Mm.
so they target them and fill out dossiers. I also At Ferguson, they were using all kinds of military and surveillance equipment against the movement, and including uh, concussion brigades, grenades, and smoke grenades, and even rubber bullets. I was also a lawyer up at Standing Rock, and we saw these not only the weaponry but this very sophisticated surveillance techniques using drones against demonstrations.
Wow.
So absolutely, people are still being targeted, and I think also I think the Republican movement is trying to make it more and more difficult to even have a demonstration,
Right.
and declaring anything a threat or a riot.
Yeah.
So absolutely, it takes on different forms. It's got more military and surveillance forms, and now it is
Wow.
trying to get demonstrating declared illegal.
Oh
People
wow.
gather for almost anything.
Wow. Yeah. Wow. Um. Let me a quick question. Did in the Black Panthers in the movement of Black Panthers was there an issue between the East and the West in the Panther movement? Was there problems, issues
Yeah.
like Democrat?
Well, yes, there were, and
Mm-hmm.
there were somewhat two factions. There was the Huey Newton, Bobby Seale faction that started the Panthers in Oakland, and then there was the New York chapter of the Panthers, which included the Panther 21. Um, and they were more aligned with Eldridge Cleaver. And so there was a dispute between Cleaver and Huey around political issues, around militancy, around armed struggle, I think. And I think COINTELPRO really played it up and turned it into a very personal issue so that there was violence by each against the other. And I think it was perfect for the government to play on those differences. And uh, people played into that. So, yes, there was a lot of strife between particularly New York and Oakland.
Makes well, we seen that played out with Tupac and Biggie, and that's why I asked you if we would have learned about the insights that happened with the Panthers, with the Panther 21 and Newton and Bobby Seale in Oakland, we probably wouldn't have repeated those steps because we would
That's
have
a
seen an
really good
example of
point.
it not working.
That's a really good point because
Mm.
that's why we study history and that's why it's relevant
Right.
because they may use different methods, but their objective is the same, which is to suppress the black liberation movement, whatever form it takes.
Yeah.
So, learning what they did before, they drew cartoons of stereotypes of Panthers and claimed they came from SDS,
Wow.
to create strife. So, and then as I mentioned, the letter to Jeff Fort claiming the Panthers had a hit on him. So people should be aware of that and not rise to the bait necessarily of these struggles within the movement. And I think the point you make may be very good. That who benefits from those fights,
Yeah.
from those things. Yeah.
Wow. Um. Again, I want to thank you. This has been a very great talk. I'm gonna be viewing this myself 100 times, and I'm gonna read the book one more time this summer. I gotta read it one more time because it was in my library for a long time. I read it. This is a great book. I want everyone to get this. There's gonna be a link in the description. If you're serious about the struggle and you want to know about the struggle that came before you, please get that book because it is definitely nerve wracking and heartbreaking at the same time. And it's sad that we still going through the same struggles. I mean,
Yeah.
it just amazes me.
Many of your listeners may have seen or will see the movie Judas and the Black Messiah,
Yeah.
which was Hollywood's uh, interpretation of a lot of the information that we uncovered. But I think the acting of who Fred is powerful. It gives you a glimpse. It's not a full story. He didn't just become into this world, this great orator and leader, and then it doesn't show what it took to uncover that. But nevertheless, it gives us a little flavor of what the period was. It tells the story somewhat from the perspective of the informant O'Neill, which also has led to a lot of political criticism. But I think it also has led to much more interest in who Fred Hampton and the Panthers were.
Yes.
So even if it had its own take on that, the fact that people, learned who were the Panthers, what was their program, what happened to them, and then they'll dig deeper and find out from my book and other books, more about Fred Hampton. There's a marvelous documentary that was done 2 years after the raid called "The Murder of Fred Hampton," which was really good. Unfortunately, at that time, we didn't know about COINTELPRO, so it doesn't tell about the FBI raid. But if you want to get the details of, it shows Fred speaking and it shows the apartment after the raid. I think it's on YouTube. It's called "The Murder of Fred Hampton." So I hope your listeners will have want to find out more, and who this incredible 21-year-old was, who was such a threat that they had to murder him in his bed.
Wow, 21 years old. Wow. Well, Jeffery Haas, thank you again. I hope to see you again. And I definitely stay in tune to your social media platform. I see when you post stuff, you always post very important and great information. So, and I'm definitely gonna stay tuned. And you have a wonderful evening. Well, have a wonderful afternoon. It's like what? Maybe like 1 something?
A little before 2 here. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for the interview. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. This was wonderful.
Take care.
Take care. Power to the people.